Focus More, Fear Less by Tasha Spires. Chapter 3. Identifying Your Triggers. What steals your focus? Our ability to focus is such a challenge on a day-to-day basis. Being pulled in so many different directions makes it increasingly harder for us to stay on task. It's the emails, the phone notifications, the mental to-do list, and it sometimes makes you feel like, when will it end? When will we have a moment of silence? But here's what we need to know about distractions. They are tied to specific triggers like personal fears, anxieties, and conditioned responses that derail us from our true priorities. In this chapter, we will examine unique triggers that could be stealing your focus. We will uncover the fears and distractions that repeatedly take you off course and ultimately attempt to identify triggers to help you reclaim control of your time and energy. There are invisible forces at play. As humans, we all experience moments when our attention drifts. Sometimes this occurs when our phones light up with a new notification, or we start thinking about an upcoming project that suddenly takes over our minds. But these distractions aren't just external factors. They're often deeply internally rooted. Let's look at Barbara for a moment. She's a high-powered executive who prides herself on being very organized. However, despite her best attempts to stay on task, she often finds herself overwhelmed with emails. It seems no matter how many productivity apps she tries, her inbox ultimately becomes a black hole of unfinished tasks and forgotten priorities. Well, what we concluded is that Barbara's true trigger is not about the amount of emails that she's getting and not being able to sustain, but it's really about her underlying fear of missing something important and letting her team down. Barbara's scenario is pretty common because at their core, the distractions that happen to us daily often reflect a deeper psychological trigger that, if we don't address it, will keep us locked into a cycle of unproductiveness and loss of focus. Let's talk about some common triggers that steal our focus. Number 1, fear of failure. This is a huge one. When we activate that fear of making mistakes, it leads us to procrastinate, overanalyze, and avoid taking care of our task altogether. This behavior manifests itself as perfectionism, in which we spend an excessive amount of time on minor details. We convince ourselves that everything needs to be perfect, which in reality, all that is doing is paralyzing us and stealing time away from things that would be more meaningful to accomplish. Number 2, need for control. There are times when we feel we need to control every outcome, but doing so can become its own distraction. This may cause us to find ourselves constantly looking at our emails, being overly involved in projects to the point where it appears that we're micromanaging them, and overcommitting ourselves to things that could be delegated to someone else. This particular trigger is often rooted in a fear that if we don't handle it, everything is going to fall apart. Number 3, social approval. Whether we care to admit it or not, we all like a like or two on social media. However, the constant need for those likes and attention can lead to desperation for approval. This type of behavior can be a huge distraction and can take up a lot of mental real estate in our general emotional well-being. Not to mention it can weigh heavy on our overall mental capacity and self-esteem. Number 4, imposter syndrome. This can be a very paralyzing trigger because it can viciously attack the way you see yourself. Imposter syndrome can leave you with feelings of not being good enough, not feeling smart enough, not feeling like you've experienced enough to do the things that you ultimately know you are capable of doing. You start to doubt yourself, which can be very damaging to your quest to focus and even more destructive to your overall ability for growth. Number 5, fear of missing out. What did I miss? We sometimes say that jokingly, but because we live in such a hyper-connected world, we are oversensitive to constantly wanting to be updated on every new piece of information currently circulating. From news articles to blogs, we constantly want to be in the know about what's happening in our immediate surroundings and worldwide. However, being overly stimulated by so much information doesn't leave us more informed, but it ultimately leads us to be bogged down with fragments of data, which eventually start to dilute our ability to focus on one specific thing. Now it's time to recognize your personal triggers. Let's look at how to recognize the triggers that steal your focus. Number 1, keep track of your distractions. For 1 week, let's keep a distraction diary. And every time you lose focus, write down what you were doing that pulled you away from your current task. Also, write down how you felt at that moment. Ask yourself questions like, did the task that you were working on feel too hard? Did you receive a notification while you were working on that task? Did you feel bored? The goal is to ask these questions to pinpoint the exact moment you started to feel your focus shift. Number 2, examine your emotional responses. Start paying attention to how you feel when you get distracted. Are you feeling anxious, bored, or overwhelmed? Or are you in pursuit of validation? Emotions are often the key to our underlying triggers. For example, if you notice that you check your phone every time you feel overwhelmed at work, it may be a sign that stress management, not phone discipline, needs to be brought to your attention. Number 3, identify patterns. Once you start tracking your distractions, then start looking for patterns. Do you tend to get derailed when you're faced with complex or harder tasks? Does criticism send you into a spiraling episode of self-doubt? Do you procrastinate on important projects by doing busy work that feels productive but isn't? Bringing these patterns to the forefront can help you to understand the specific fears or habits that you need to address.